Hey, this is Mr. Jerdy. We're going to be talking about scatter plots. So this is something you could definitely write down on a piece of paper for notes for this, for chapter 9. Probably one of the most helpful things for this. So there's a couple important words that you need to know when you're talking about scatter plots. The first one is relationships, right here. Big Ideas chooses to use the word relationships when they're talking about scatter plots. And really better words are trend and correlation, but I'll go into that here. So if you're going to describe the relationship, and that is the key question of chapter 9, describe the relationship. There's a couple things you got to do in order to describe a relationship that you see on a graph or on a scatter plot. That's say if it's positive or negative, or if there's no relationship. We'll talk about that. After that, you identify gaps, clusters, and outliers. So that's what we're looking at. Let's take a look at some scatter plots and see what that looks like. Remember, relationship, trend, and correlation all really mean the same thing when we're talking about scatter plots. So I'm pulling up the first section in 9.1. It's got the definition of a scatter plot right here. It's just relating two different pieces of data and displaying them on a graph for you. It's writing one of them on the x-axis and one of them on the y-axis, creating coordinates and making points all over the place. So let's take a look at this one on restaurant sandwiches. There's a play button here that you can watch next to examples if you forgot about that, something you could do if you're stuck on something. So here's one with restaurant sandwiches, and it's got two different graphs. We're just going to take a look at this one that has stuff on it that's kind of helpful, what we're talking about here. So I can kind of see, if I'm looking at this, the bottom is fat in grams, and the side is calories. So it looks like it's comparing how many grams of fat there are in a sandwich versus how many calories it gives you. So first question it asks up here in A is, how many calories are in the sandwich that contains 17 grams of fat? So you could go over to 17 right here, right between 15 and 20, and you could go up, and it looks like there's a dot there. So that would be 400 based on this graph. If you're given the X amount, you can just go up and see what the Y amount was. So another one for B, how many grams of fat are in a sandwich that contains 600 calories? Well, go up to 600 and just go over until you meet a dot. Well, there's one right there. And then you can check straight down. Looks like that would be 30 grams. If you had a sandwich that had 600 calories, it's probably going to be around 30 grams. So that's kind of how that works in finding points on a scatter plot. If I was going to describe the relationship here, I would say if this is positive or negative. This is definitely going up to the right. And I know it's positive because as fat goes up, calories goes up. They both increase. If I was going to look at gaps and outliers and clusters, we'll take a look at that on the next ones we look at here, if you're wondering about those. So describing this, you'd say this is a positive linear relationship, or it has a positive trend, or it has a positive correlation. You can see that the data kind of goes together. Sometimes you pick data for a scatter plot and it doesn't really match up at all. So let's take a look at another one up here. Here's the different things you might see. For scatter plots, you might see a positive trend. You might see a negative trend. Sometimes there is a trend, but it's not linear. So you would just say it's not a linear relationship. You see that up here. And then no relationship. Sometimes you find data and you put it on a graph and you get an X and a Y, and it comes up pretty random and there's not really anything that you can base off of it. You call it no relationship. There's no trend. So if you're going to describe the data, you just say there's no relationship. Okay, let's go through all four things. Let's go through all of these things on these graphs right here. I'll pull those up again just so you see. We're going to go through number one, is it positive, negative, or no relationship? Let's talk about gaps, let's talk about clusters, and talk about outliers so we know what each one is. Okay, looking at this TV one, we'll do that one first. So it says right up here, describe the relationship. That is the key question. You'll see that every time on almost all your questions tomorrow on 9.1. So, is it positive, negative, or no relationship? Looks like it's pretty steep going up to the right. So I'm going to call this a positive relationship. It's linear. They're lining up pretty well. Okay, then I'm going to talk about gaps. A gap is where there's an actual trend in this spot here. I'm not talking about over here in this random point. I'm talking about in here. Is there a spot that has a definite opening where there's stuff isn't? And that's right in here. And if you're going to say that, so you would need to list coordinates or y values or x values to explain it. I'll probably say from 500 to 1500, there's a gap. And I just say one gap, and there's where it is, from 500 to $1,500. Okay, if I'm going to talk about clusters, cluster is where there are more grouped up. In this one, there's not a whole lot of points, but there's definitely these four are closer together and they're almost on top of each other. So I'd call that a cluster. And to identify where it is, just list the coordinate pair. Just list where the middle of that cluster happens. So I'd say 30 and 500. Just keep it simple. 30 comma 500 in parentheses. That gets me right there in that. It's not perfect, but that's going to attract my eyes or whoever's looking at it, their eyes in that direction, and it'll make sense to them. Okay, an outlier is something that is not within the trend, that's far off. I mean, it should make sense. If there's something close enough, you're just going to have to make your best choice on this, whether you think it's an outlier or not. And sometimes it can vary between people and what they think. And I think this one definitely is an outlier because most of these are perfectly on the line. Like they're pretty close to straight. So I'm going to call that one an outlier. I would say, hey, there's one outlier, and that is at 70, comma, let's say 2,300. Just to keep it simple, 2,370. And we would have gone through all the things. We talked about the relationship, the gaps, the clusters, and the outliers. Let's take a look at this one right here. The age of a person and the number of pets they own. And as you can see, there's not really a relationship there. There's nothing lining up. And it doesn't matter how old you are, it's not going to determine how many pets you can own. I mean, depending on how old you are, you might have more or less pets. It's not going to change, and that makes sense here. The graph shows that it doesn't relate. So no relationship. Let's talk about gaps. I don't really see any gaps. I don't see a cluster. I don't see like people at age 30 seem to have 4. I don't see that. Seems to be they've got a wide range of ages. And then outliers, I'm not really seeing anything as an outlier because everything's random there. Hey, and I want to take a look at this one point right here and talk some cool stuff about this because you can determine a lot from a point on a scatter plot if there's a good trend. And this is definitely a good trend here. And if I'm taking a look at TVs and I'm wondering why is this point way out there? Well, there's several different reasons that it might be out there. Like this is a big TV. This is a 70 incher and it's going for pretty cheap. Like 70 inches should be way up here in price. Either this is a deal, like Black Friday, somebody's getting a great deal on a TV, so they lower the price way down, or maybe it's a display TV. It's on display, and people are kind of walking by, and it's the last one, so they sell it at a good deal. Maybe it's damaged. Who knows? Maybe it's an off-brand that's really inexpensive for the size. Maybe it's not going to be as quality. Okay, and then I'm noticing this gap here. Bunch of things you could determine from why this gap is there. Well, there's not very many TVs in this price range. Like, you got your simple small TVs, and when you jump to a bigger TV, it skips from $500 and it goes right into the thousands. Like, it's just showing me at this time there's not many TVs in that type of range. There's just not any. Like, so that's kind of determining, and you can see how you can learn a bunch of different things from that. Okay, let's go back to this. Make sure we got it. Remember, relationship, trend, and correlation are all really similar things. You're just saying saying the same thing. Describing the relationship, tell if it's positive, negative, or no relationship, and then talk about the gaps, clusters, and outliers. Tell where they are. List the coordinate pairs. You guys got this. Hope you have a great day.